Ladies and gentlemen, esteemed partners and distinguished guests, today we stand at a pivotal moment in Africa's journey towards a sustainable and prosperous future. As we gather at this esteemed summit organized by the African Center for Economic Transformation and in partnership with notable institutions such as CAPA, IDRI, SAE, and Akosombo Industrial Company Limited. Our focus is clear. That's to leverage external finance for Africa's green industrialization. Africa is uniquely positioned to become a global hub for green manufacturing. This shift is not just an environmental imperative, but a golden opportunity to accelerate our economic transformation while technologies at our disposal can drastically decarbonize our industrial activities. Moreover, the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement, ACTA, presents unprecedented opportunities for cross-border trade, bolstering regional value chains. The Africa Climate Summit, ACS 2023, has been a momentous event, bringing to light the narrative on climate positive finance and investment. Albeit mostly unsecured, mark a significant milestone. However, the challenge that lies ahead of us is monumental. How to effectively channel these commitments into tangible, impactful investments in green industrialization. Our vision for a green industry must be African-led, harnessing digital and technological tools to foster development. Governments must create conducive business and investment environments to accelerate these investments. Likewise, stakeholders must develop project pipelines that are not only green, but also inclusive and certifiable. It is imperative that the African private sector and financiers take active roles in project design and implementation. We must also address long-standing challenges such as inadequate domestic resource mobilization and heavy debt burdens to create the fiscal space necessary for investing in crucial infrastructure and skills development. Focusing specifically on green industrialization, there is a need for more targeted work to improve business environments in this sector. Today, our objective is crystal clear. We aim to establish specific actions that translate the ACS 2023 commitments into real investments in Africa's green industrialization. Our focus will be on green value chains and leveraging digital and technological tools, from data provision for informed investment decisions to using artificial intelligence for project pipelines and digital tools to enhance business environments, including taxation, electronic payments, and economic policies. In conclusion, the path towards green industrialization in Africa is filled with both opportunities and challenges. Our collective efforts today will define the trajectory of this transformation. It is through concrete actions and collaborative endeavors that we can realize the potential of green industrialization in Africa. Before I thank you and I sit down, I would like to throw in this one, that Ghana, and for that matter, most of African countries, are all members of the Climate Vulnerable Forum and then the V20. These countries are known to be on the front line of the climate crisis. The impact has been so devastating, and so therefore they share common degree of deprivation that has affected their economies. In order to get out of vulnerability, move on to resilience, and finally to prosperity, we've undertaken to do what we call CPPs, Climate Prosperity Plans. Bangladesh and Sri Lanka have had their own. Ghana is on the verge of finishing its own. Embedded in these CPPs are most of the tangible, bankable, concrete investment pipelines that we do seek investment to promote this green industrialization. So all that we're going to do today fits perfectly into that kind of thinking that the CVF is currently doing. And come to think of it, the CVF is for 68 countries across the globe: Africa, Caribbean, Middle East, Latin America, elsewhere, representing 1.6 billion people. And it is worth noting that the presidency, the chair is in Ghana, that the president of Ghana, Nana Addo Dankwa Akufo-Addo, is the chair, while I act as the presidential special envoy. And so this side event, this summit, is very much welcome within the scope of the CVF and the V20. I thank you all for your commitment and look forward to a fruitful discussion and a path forward filled with sustainable growth and prosperity for our dear continent, Africa. May God bless us all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Honorable Kokofu. So this afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, my name is John Asafo-J. I'm the Senior Fellow at the African Center for Economic Transformation, and I'll be moderating this session on leveraging external finance for Africa's green industrialization. So we are privileged to have a good lineup of speakers, and I would like to introduce the speakers to take their stage. So we have Professor Lopez, Jane Lumumba, Philip, and we have Margaret Imprem. And so let me start with introduction of the panels, but the way we're going to operate this session is that the panelists will make their submissions of around 10 minutes each, and then after that we are going to have questions and answers from the floor. We're already late, so we'll try and be quick and stick to the point. So on my immediate left is Jane Lumumba. Jane is the Africa lead for the Climate Champions team. Before joining the Climate Champions team, she was a manager for the global sectors and governance at KPMG, which is working on infrastructure and net zero cities. So she has extensive experience in working with cities, climate action, localization. So we're pleased to have Jane with us. The next to her is Professor Carlos Lopez. He's currently a professor at the Nelson Mandela School of Public Governance at the University of Cape Town. And he's been an associate fellow of several universities, including Sciences Po in Paris. He's also the chair of the African Climate Foundation. And previously, he served at the UN and at the AU. At the AU, he was the executive secretary from 2012 to 2016. So, Professor, we are pleased to have you here. Next to him is Philip Osafo-Kwako. Philip is the director at Akosombo Industrial Company Limited in Akosombo, Ghana. He also serves as a visiting fellow at the African Center for Economic Transformation. He's previously worked with DFID, which is now FCDO, McKinsey & Company, and was also an economic advisor to the government of Nigeria. So Philip, thank you for joining us. And then last but not the least is Margaret Imprem. Margaret works in the areas of climate justice, climate governance, and gender equality. She's currently the Assistant Global Coordinator of Youth Climate Council's Global Alliance and has been a member of the National Youth Action Group on Climate Change. So thank you, Margaret, for being with us. We know that Africa has been one of the least affected in terms of, the most affected in terms of climate change. But the evidence shows that the current climate finance, Africa has received the least of climate finance. On top of that, African countries have shown a willingness to try to reduce their emissions, and they've signed up to the Paris Agreement, where they've agreed to reduce emissions. All of this depends on finance, and so the issue of finance is very important. And so we'll be discussing that, and also how Africa can actually undertake green industrialization or climate positive industrialization. So I'll start with a few questions on this, and then, as I said, we'll turn it over to the panel. So let me start with Jane on climate finance. What do you see as the key barriers to financing a just and energy transition for Africa? That's my first question. And what interventions do you see that we could use to address these barriers? Yes, can we have the mic here?
Now? Yeah? Okay, thank you very much for inviting me to this panel. I've just spent the last couple of days addressing this issue of financing the just transition. And what we are seeing is that just transition looks different across different sectors, across different regions. And the African narrative that we have at the Climate Champions is that it must be financed, it must be managed, and it must be equitable. Now, one of the biggest barriers is that there's a lack of understanding across the transition vulnerability, because the most vulnerable and the least responsible will not only experience climate shocks, but will also experience green industrial and green growth shocks. So some of these shocks also need to be financed. And the question is, who will finance them? Do we know those shocks? And what can different project developers in the continent do to integrate just investment into their just transition plans? Of course, access to cheap finance is a big problem. That is a major barrier to financing the JETPs. We're hearing that, for example, investment into renewable energy, particularly solar, in the continent is significantly low. So, of course, we have to ensure that we have access to cheap credit. And then secondly, it's also about domestic resources. How can we mobilize our domestic capital to ensure that we can fund our own JETPs? And I also want to reference the Africa Green Industrialization Initiative that was launched by His Excellency Ruto of Kenya on December 1st. And that sort of showcased the continent's readiness to be open to investment and to partner with various stakeholders within the transition value chain to fund green growth within the continent. And it was, I think, over 5 billion worth of investment, which is even more than the 4.5 that the UAE committed at the Africa Climate Summit. And for those of you who were at the Africa Climate Summit, we saw there was a Africa Private Sector Declaration at the margins of the ACS. And what this declaration does is to really position the role of the private sector in financing and playing a very key role in climate action in the continent. And that was witnessed by the Africa Business Leaders Coalition, which is a group that really has showcased over the last year that African private sector is ready to contribute to finance climate action. And so it is about partnerships, it's about diversifying sources of finance. And of course, we also want to see an increase in philanthropic capital for those early stage developers, which is very lacking currently. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Margaret. Can I go to Professor Lopez? So it's been suggested that Africa can avoid the sort of growth that China undertook, which is high pollution, and we can move to green growth or climate positive growth. So for those of us who are not abreast with this new thinking, can you first of all tell us what green growth is, preferably with some examples in industry, and what do you see as the 3 or 4 critical barriers to achieving green growth or green industrialization, and then follow that with how those can be addressed?
Thank you. Well, I'm old enough to remember the time when it was not very fashionable to talk about industrial policy. Not because some countries were not practicing it. In fact, the Southeast Asian miracle is very much based on what we now call modern industrial policy. But because, it was running against the idea that Africa should take advantage of its natural resources and should diversify its economy. Now, diversification and industrialization are not the same. You can diversify from cocoa to coffee. That's diversification, but you are still exactly in the same economic structure. So what this battle was about was the right for Africans to choose a path that was going to modernize and structurally transform their economies. And this was not really allowed because the comparative advantage theory was very static and was saying, you take advantage of your natural resources. And eventually that meant exporting commodities without value addition. Now, today we are in a different moment. Everybody wants to do industrial policy. But those who have the means, US, the European Green Deal, the Japanese Green Deal, the Korean development, green economy, etc., they have stimulus packages that are basically subsidizing the transformation of their productive sector to low carbon. We are latecomers, so we have difficulties reaching at the same level of understanding of what can be done if subsidies are basically a trump card used by those that are powerful because they can just print money because they don't have the same macroeconomic difficulties and not the same constraints that we have. Therefore, we are in a position as latecomers of not only facing this development, which is like neo-Keynesian economic theory for those who are familiar with it, but practiced just by the powerful. But we have on top of it all the other problems. We have intellectual property that is skewed. We have trade barriers that are increasing, including with green protectionism. We have difficulties with logistics. We have adequation of our labor pool to the requirements of industrialization, and the list goes on. Ecosystem issues, regulatory issues, all the rest. So in face of all that battery of difficulties, we may think that it is not possible to move Africa to a low carbon economy without major influx of money from the external actors. And this is exactly what we have to avoid, because that becomes a trap. No country has actually industrialized just on the basis of external influx of capital. It's important, but you have to increase your fiscal space to such a level that you are going to be able to have the last say and make your choices. And in order to do that, you need eventually to make sure that you are going to have a certain number of changes in your economic policy. I like to just, capture them in three baskets or three buckets. The first is that you need to have a high level of ambition because things are moving very fast. Our demographics are incredible. So you cannot really think just very short term. You have to think long term. But in doing so, you have to move to the second basket, which is the capacity for you to prioritize. You cannot do everything. You have to pick some value chains and you have to invest on those. And then the third is that you need a lot of alignment or coordination, if you prefer. Because once you have picked your priorities, you need to align all the economic structure to respond to that priority. And this is very difficult. So some countries are capable of doing it. Others have much more hard time doing it. And the ones that are progressing are the ones that can align these three. Ambition is about understanding the megatrends because they are moving very fast. The issue of priorities is policy coherence. And the issue of alignment is beyond coherence, the capacity to manage effectively the various economic actors that are going to make the policy coherence succeed. And I think if you look into where it's happening in a number of countries around the world, but it's also happening in Africa. Where it's happening in Africa? When people are capable of understanding that for certain areas, being a latecomer can become an advantage. Not for all. And everybody picks the critical minerals as one example. It's very true. Because we are now in a rush for critical minerals. Africa has a lot of them. So we can definitely build value chains as latecomers to take advantage of it. But for that, we need to avoid the commodity dependency trap that I was mentioning before. But there are other areas that we can make a difference too. Agro-processing, pharmaceuticals, and definitely textiles. So these are job creators in mass. That is what we need. Because, automation, robotization, even artificial intelligence is going to change the landscape quite considerably. But for these that I just mentioned, you will continue to have a lot of labor intensity still that is going to make a difference for Africa.
Thank you, Professor. So you mentioned the need to prioritize and then maybe select some value chains, depending on comparative advantage. So I think that leads to the next speaker, Philip, who is actually involved in one of these areas. Philip. So looking at where you stand from a Kosovo industrial company, can you tell us the prospects for scaling green in value chains,
yes.
as Professor has mentioned? And then, of course, look at the challenges that from your perspective, and maybe how these challenges could be addressed.
Thank you so much, John. And John, in my short 4 or 5 minutes I have, there's actually a few slides that I had put together. And if they could pop it up, I'll just speak to it very briefly.
Go ahead.
If I could stand. Okay, thank you so much. Thank you so much. So I just want to share with you a few slides on this whole idea of green industrialization, climate positive industrialization, and the whole idea that while it is the case that we are coming a bit late to the game, we have an opportunity now in West Africa to actually leverage some of our commodities and develop them in a green, in a sustainable, in a secular, in a decarbonized way, which is really the direction in which sort of the world and global demand is moving. My name is Philip. I'm director at a textile company in Ghana called Akosombo Textiles, and I'll share a few slides with you. We produce these fabrics, very colorful fabrics, which you see all over West Africa, one of which I'm wearing, and I see a few of you are also wearing it. I hope they are from our factory, but that is still forgivable for now. And we actually do quite a bit. So we sell in the retail markets. We supply most of the high school uniforms in Ghana, but also in Nigeria. We do in the markets in Kano, if you go out there, for corporates in Ghana. And finally, we export also into the US. So for our American customers, if you go to Joanne Fabrics, for example, you'd see some of our fabrics over there. But of course, has just been on the wax prints. And the story about green industrialization for us is how can we sort of diversify and do much more on this value chain to produce T-shirts, to produce denim jeans, all this type of stuff, but to do it also in a green, sustainable, secular, decarbonized way. This is our factory now in Eastern Ghana. It's just on the banks of the Volta Lake. So it sits on about 100 acres now, and it's one of the largest employers. So it's employing about 700-800 people in Ghana now. So it's a huge sort of industrial setup. 700-800 direct jobs, 2,000 total jobs when you put together. But I think we have to do more, and we must do more, given all these challenges with youth unemployment and demographic transition that is going to happen in Africa. And certainly when you think of automation, when you think of AI, a time is going to come when our labor-intensive advantage will not be required by the world anymore. And what can we do? Thankfully, Akosombo Textiles now, given that we are located next to the Volta Dam in Ghana, actually uses hydropower. So just from birth, at inception, we really have been green by design. All the way going back to our first president in Nkrumah's time, it was set up in this way. A lot of our other things we do on our boilers, steam generation, energy generation, we actually use biomass to do this. And we did this because it was cheap. We didn't do it to get any sort of like credits from anybody. No, I mean, we've never applied for any credits. We just did it because it was cheap. It's about 70% cheaper running on agro waste versus running on diesel. DFID brought in these consultants from BCG to help us. And later they said, oh, you've decarbonized your supply chain. I'm like, yes, but we just were looking for cheap stuff. And the cheap way happened to be decarbonized, to be green. And that has worked very nicely in our favor on hydropower, on decarbonized sort of biomass generation. And that is what we use now. But we think the opportunity is bigger. And it's bigger because West Africa has about 10% of the world's cotton exports. And the global market now is looking for, traceability, sustainability in all of this. The global market now wants vertically integrated production. Much of this cotton from West Africa goes out in its raw form to Vietnam, to Bangladesh, and then it's transformed into yarn, into fabric, and into garments. And it's only the used clothing that ends up in West Africa. And if you think about it, it just doesn't make sense. So whatever we can do to actually produce this vertically integrated production with a low carbon footprint, that is really the vision. And I think that's one of the opportunities of green industrialization to our mind. This is again the point I was making. Although there's a lot of cotton in the region, what is really happening is a lot of used clothing. I mean, it's a bit unfortunate or interesting that Kantamanto market in Ghana is one of the largest destinations for used clothing in the world. And our goal is to say, how can you actually do some of the recycling of this fabric to actually sort of support the work we want to do? And then there's the youth unemployment problem. I mean, you land at any airport in any of the African countries, and this is what you'd see. You just see young people retailing very cheap products to you. And if you think it's bad now, just wait till 2030, or surely wait till 2050. This stuff is going to explode. And if you see young people crossing the Sahara or crossing the Mediterranean, it's not because they want to swim. It's just because they want a livelihood. And if you see them sort of like, bulging into the cities, there is a demographic challenge going to hit us. And something has to be done. And I like what Professor Lopez said. It's labor-intensive manufacturing or industrialization. And if this is done in a green and sustainable way, we think this could be pretty transformational. And this is our window of opportunity to do it. At the same time, what I find interesting is that the world is now also looking for sustainably produced garments. So the EU, for example, has changed all its legislation. By 2025, the EU would require that every garment sold in the EU should have something called a digital passport, where you can track where the fiber came from, where the garmenting was done, that it was done in an ESG way. So if we can fix that in Africa, Prof, that is an opportunity for us, and we have to take it, We had visitors from Calvin Klein and Hilfiger to our factory. They are interested in sourcing. This is the annual report of Calvin Klein this year. They said by 2025, they want to make sure 100% of their cotton and wool and viscose is sustainably sourced. By 2030, 100% even of polyester. Guys, we are sitting on that resource in West Africa. If we can actually sort of package this and sell it to them, we would be the destination for this. And then you push to command a premium on it. So it is a big opportunity, John, and it's one thing that we are well positioned to take advantage of. Now, how are we going to do it? Well, it's very interesting because we are located right on the banks of the Volta Lake. We are at one edge of the lake, and at the other end of the lake, at the other port of the lake, that is where the cotton of West Africa is. So there's a whole cotton belt across the Sahel, which straddles sort of the southern bits of the Sahel. So Burkina Faso, Northern Ivory Coast, Northern Ghana, Northern Togo, you get 10% of the world's cotton. You can transport that cotton down the lake. So you transport it again in a very low carbon way, and then you bring it down, and then you do all the transformation into yarn, into fabric, and ultimately into garments. So we are actually very well positioned to take advantage of this opportunity. The park, the industrial park, is located right here at the tip of the Volta Lake, and it's just 1 hour away from the port. And again, now the government has built a railway line that connects us straight to the port. So our vision is to see this whole enclave transformed into a green belt, a belt for green industrial manufacturing out in Ghana. The value chain looks like this. You can move from cotton to fiber, to yarn, to fabric, and then to the garments. And we know the job potential of this industry. Sri Lanka has done it, Vietnam has done it, China has done it. We need to start somewhere, but we need to do it in a green way, in a sustainable way, in a decarbonized way, in a circular way. And it would support all the jobs, right from the farmers to the fabric in the manufacturing, and then ultimately in the garmenting section, where you get sort of a lot of the jobs coming out of it. There's a big push on circularity. So if you can recycle the fibers, as we have shown here, that could be a game changer, because now you'll be selling recycled fibers also. And as I said, Ghana is one of the largest destinations for used clothing. So we have this big opportunity to do the recycling. The parliament in Ghana just passed a bill now for industrial hemp farming. And hemp is actually twice as profitable as cotton. So again, watch this space, you know. I walked into the shop for Patagonia in Washington, D.C. this summer, and half of the stuff in Patagonia is either recycled or is coming out from hemp. And it is really good margins, and it's very expensive. You know, it's a T-shirt for $60, $80, and people want it. So this is our chance now to take advantage of that. We are not going to catch up with Bangladesh or Vietnam overnight, but we can do it in our own way, in a different way, in a sustainable way, in a way for the future. Again, the brands have started visiting us in Ghana, so I just show a few pictures, but H&M has visited, Eddie Bauer has visited, Calvin Klein, PVH, again, we've spoken to them, Ralph Lauren, and then the Patagonia folks also, we have spoken to them. We've visited some of their factories in Sri Lanka, in Vietnam, and it's a very good, exciting off-take arrangement we want to put in place, because then the job creation potential and the economic opportunity becomes very palpable. I'll be honest, we are doing the wax sprints now. It is interesting for us, but we think the opportunity and the prize is much bigger if you think of what the global market is actually demanding. Just a few more slides. So this is really the vision for what the new plant is going to look like once upgraded. We have worked with the World Bank and the IFC to do a lot of the background due diligence, as well as the Boston Consulting Group. So we are very, very sort of pleased with the investment case, the business case to actually drive this infrastructure. I want to end with 2 or 3 slides. And these are important slides when we think of the transformation. Because frankly, we've been talking about economic transformation in Africa for far too long. At COP, there's been a lot of discussion on pledges and money. Again, there's a bit of pledge sort of fatigue, if you ask me. You know, now we want to see stuff actually trickling down. And if you look at what textiles and garments have done, for example, in Bangladesh, Bangladesh exports about $50 billion and creates about 10 million jobs out of it. Look at Sri Lanka, it's about $5 billion and it has 1 million jobs out of it. Ghana is nowhere, we are just starting. And I always tell people that the cocoa sector in Ghana, which has been the case, you know, from Nkrumah's time, from the time when I was in school in Ghana, I mean, I see some of my classmates in the audience, it was $2 billion for cocoa. All of Ghana's cocoa exports, $2 billion. It still is about $2 billion. But Sri Lanka is able to get $5 billion out of its textiles and garments. Now, that should be a challenge for us. It should be an opportunity for us if we can do this, because it would really be transformational, and we can do this in a green, sustainable way. The world is asking for green industrial parks, for something called net zero industrial parks. This is what the World Economic Forum is saying about net zero industrial parks. There's a lot in sort of Eastern US, in the Western Europe, in Asia. There's none in Africa. And our goal is that the Akosombo Industrial Enclave, this is something that the VRA colleagues are here, that we will transform the Akosobo Industrial Enclave into Africa's first net zero industrial park, where you'll see green manufacturing, labor-intensive light manufacturing, using and taking advantage of local commodities that we have, and generating the jobs that we so desperately need for our youth in the continent. My final slide, the value chain will support the livelihoods of about 1 million farmers, 10,000 new direct factory jobs. We will do this by 2025. Once the funding comes through, we will come to COP in 1 year, in 2 years, and we will show the jobs, and 50,000 indirect jobs across the local communities. And this is the transformation we are talking about. At the UN, they talk a lot about the SDGs. This checks very nicely across all the SDGs on anti-poverty, on gender equality, on education, on clean energy, on industrialization. It is one of those projects that we think green industrialization can really concretely solve. So I think there's a lot of excitement about this, and it's something we are very passionate about supporting for the job creation and for the green growth area. So I look forward to more questions and discussion on it. And if you know any off-takers from any of the big fashion brands who want it, please tell them to come to Ghana. We'll be ready for them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Philip. So the youth are a big part of this green industrialization. So the last but not the least speaker is Margaret Imprim, and she'll tell us about prospects for the youth, what are some of the challenges you're facing, and what concrete actions could be taken to address those constraints.
Carried away.
All right, thank you very much. So I'll say that what I'm going to say will be very brief because all our speakers have really spoken about it, especially you, Prof, and you, Philip. You really talked a lot about. I'm really happy that the nation has tried so much to bring a lot of jobs. But I think one thing that we have to identify in the youth are very ambitious, very innovative. And most people would leave the Mediterranean not just to swim, but to try and get some better living because they want to explore their own innovative ways. And unfortunately, the finance to get that is very difficult. And if you look at even how to bring in green businesses, how to even recycle plastics and waste and even bring out product out of it, very expensive. There were times that we even went to some organizations and the machines that they actually used for those things were very costly, and most of the things were even imported. So imagine up-and-coming youth who needs all of these things, and this youth has the idea, has the innovation. This youth cannot get the machines because they are very expensive. And also producing these things are also quite expensive. Unfortunately, production of green items are very costly. You have to now go through a lot of process, and you cannot be mechanical or you cannot be manual about it, because if you want a large scale, you need some machines to do that. So the first thing that has been a challenge or a constraint has been the finance, because not everyone would get a job in your firm, for instance. Some will try, they will apply, they won't get jobs. Most youth now identify that they have that power to create jobs for themselves. And so if you realize most people start, from the green businesses want to use recycled products to create jobs. Even for other youth, some also want to use what we know around us to also create jobs. Unfortunately, these are very expensive. That is one. And the second thing is also having them using the awareness or the knowledge. Most people want to know how to go about it. Unfortunately, they don't know how to go about it. There's some youth that maybe all they know is apply for job. Or maybe all they know is just go submit your CV and then you get a job. They probably would have tried other ways if they were given the knowledge. So that would also bring us to the case of capacity building, where the youth are aware of what they need to do to get things to work for them. Because as you know, African youth are the largest population. And if they don't know how to even go about this green industrialization, for instance, the, let me use for lack of better use of it, the elderly would try their best but will not have any youth to support them because they don't know how to go about it. So in solving things, one, the finance is very important, and two, lots of trainings need to be done, lots of trainings. And the third thing is all of these things involve policies. It's important to let the youth be aware of the policies. So if someone wants to start maybe a shoemaking business out of maybe used leather or something from somewhere, the person needs to know the policies that would enable the person maybe access these things, maybe in a subsidized way. Maybe Ghana would bring subsidy in production. And if the person doesn't have that information, the person will not be able to even go about it. So one, there has to be policy awareness about all of these things. And I know, of course, there will be some policies in order to facilitate these things, to make things work, particularly for the youth. So there has to be some kind of policy awareness. There has to be education. And the youth at this point in time would have to leverage on each other, because one person can have the mind, but we need lots of hands together. And so we will need the government, we will need the private sector supporting the youth in doing this. Sometimes you see some youth trying so hard, and they can only fall on micro grants. They can only fall on international corporations bringing small grants because that is what they think they can use. But if we have the government sector, if we have the private sector pushing money into what they are doing, I mean, they will not go outside wherever they are in Ghana or Africa because they know that they have their own that are willing to back them. So it's important that whatever a youth is doing, if it's identified, it has to be pushed out for everyone to see. And in such cases, it's easier for there to be investment because the youth's economic input adds to the nation's input. It's not just the private sector, not just the government sector. So it has to be pushed up, not just encouraged. It has to be pushed up for other investors to see it. And once investors see it and investors push money into it, it's going to even build that youth and even other youth. So there will not be crimes, or there will not be lots of migration in other countries because of green work. So even what Gaio, in our own way of building this amongst the youth, is we have a zero waste strategy, zero waste project we do, where we work with cities, municipalities in Accra and in some other cities. And what we do is that we work with the community, with the waste workers, because there's lots of waste in the system. We work with the waste workers, the waste pickers. We work with all the people over there, and we help them understand that waste is not waste. It can be used. So we bring them all together. We work with the municipalities. They bring everyone together, and we train them on how to change that waste, in this case, the solid waste, the plastic waste, into other products. So where we have people coming by, we show to them that this is something that this city has done, these women have done, this community has done, and then they're able to even appreciate what's going on and even, give them finances to even upskill that. So it's really important to, one, identify whatever the youth is doing and also have that push coming on board. And we also, in our own little way, try to give some re-granting to some organizations, some individuals, for them to also bring up what they're doing. And lastly, what we do is we have identified food waste in Ghana and in some other parts of Africa. So what we do is we bring that awareness for composting, where our food waste does not just go to the bin, but is converted to fertilizers. So people can even use that and not waste money buying fertilizer, because your food waste can become your fertilizer. And you can have your own garden in your home, and you can make your own food, you can feed yourself and not really pray for food to come in season before you can get something to eat. So I'll say these are the constraints, and when we have all the sectors supporting the youth in all of these areas, policy will not be an issue, finance will not be an issue, and even knowledge and capacity building will not be an issue for the youth.
Thank you. So, thank you very much. So, what I hear from you is that finance is very crucial. Policy is important, incorporating the youth, and of course, the private sector has a role to play. So, I think I can turn it now to the audience for questions, comments that you may have, which you can address to any of the speakers or to all of them. So the floor is now open. Now, I think you have to come forward because we want to get you on the mic. So you need to come forward. All right. Yes. So can you come forward? Yeah.
Okay, thank you. My question is to the Akosombo tester. I really appreciate the economic opportunities that we are trying to exploit in the industry, and I think it will help us. How are we optimizing the carbon emissions with the employment and economic opportunities? As at now, the textile industry, yesterday I was listening to one of the talks, and one of the difficult areas that we are controlling, that difficult places, sectors that decarbonization is really contesting: steel production, cement production, textile. And textile is contributing about 10% of the global emissions as at now. I heard you making mention of greenway, greenway, greenway. Like when you look at your value chain, we see the energy intensity, chemical production, the the um, the impact of your chemical, the disposal, and its impact on our water bodies. What you touched on was only the power production, whereby we are using the biomass. So apart from that one, there are other sectors that, with the estimated growth that you are looking at, the impact that is going to bring on the environment. How are we optimizing that with respect to economic growth?
Okay.
Thank you.
I think I'll take a few more questions and then. Okay. So there's a hand there and a hand over there. Yes. Can you please come forward if you don't mind?
Yeah, thank you very much. My name is Fifi Bwedi from the Ministry of Sanitation and Water Resources. And I took much interest in the last two speakers. And I want to begin with the speaker from Akosombo Textiles. For us, one thing that is very important is that when we talk of industrialization, many a times the focus is on production and manufacturing. But then there is also the waste, the end of life, managing the waste as well. And for us, if you look at, the statistics you gave about the second-hand clothing that flocks into the country, currently on the global dashboard for tracking second-hand clothing, Ghana is leading in terms of receiving the largest stock of second-hand clothing. And from data, we could see that 30 to 40% of this second-hand clothing upon arrival are already end of life. So we are having difficulties in dealing with this end-of-life second-hand textiles. And so I was hoping to hear what you have in place at Akosombo Textiles in terms of how to take back the textiles that would have been sold on the market and be able to deal with them, recycle them, so that we're able to take them off the waste stream. And also, I was hoping, and I don't know whether if this is something that is within your remit, but how can Akosombo Textiles, being the leading textile industry in Ghana, also collaborate multi-sectorially and then internationally to be able to help salvage these end-of-life textiles and then also recycle them? Because I think that is a market that is currently untapped. And I look forward to maybe some deeper deliberations on how we could collaborate on that front. Thank you.
Okay, we'll take one more question and then we'll come back to you. One more question, please. We'll have another round, so be patient.
Thank you very much. Alex Benkenstein from the South African Institute of International Affairs. Fantastic presentations, really inspiring. Also reflecting on the Africa Climate Summit, as we've said in our title, I think something that was very remarkable there in the discussions around finance is instead of the normal messaging about there needing to be more finance, the finance needs to be more accessible, there was a definite emphasis on also understanding systemic change that is needed in the global financial system. And that's different. That was a little bit different in the messaging that we heard. We know that a lot of capital is in the north. We also know that a lot of capital flows out of the south into the north. I guess reflecting in this very broad framing then, what are the specific steps that could be taken across different industries or at a broad level where support could be provided from a policy level? I'm kind of teasing out where the potential is for public-private partnership, for blended finance, these areas. And then just specifically on the textiles, something that didn't come up much, but obviously one of the issues when we're talking about sustainable production, environmental, is then also the outflow and the water production, dyeing and that sort of thing. I wonder if you might just reflect a little bit on those operations and where that fits within the broader sustainability narrative around textiles.
Okay, so Philip first, and then we go to Prof.
Well, thank you very much. I think I have.
You want to come here?
Sorry, if you could kindly put up the slides up again. Thank you so much for the questions on the cotton to garments value chain. And I think the questions were all fantastic. So one about sort of sustainability in the entire textiles to garments value chain. And then the second one also about waste and recycling. So there's a much longer sort of work we have done with the IFC and supported by the Boston Consulting Group, and this type of work, sort of the business case, the business plan. And I'm happy to discuss it in more detail with anyone who is interested. And certainly if anybody has access to financing also to support us in the expansion, let me put in a pitch in here that will be very excited to discuss further about it. But to answer the questions, so the value chain looks something like this, right? So you start with the cotton, the seed cotton, you gin it into fiber, and then you spin the fiber into yarn. And then the yarn is then either woven or knitted into a fabric. And then it's dyed and finished into sort of a colorful print. And ultimately, it's sewn in the CMT factories into the garments. A lot of the jobs, if you take the job lens, comes from the CMT end. And the pollution concerns in the industry are really mostly around the dyeing and the finishing stage. I'll come to it in a moment. But if I just jump onto the circularity bits of it, the recycling bits of it, because there was a question on that, you're absolutely right. Ghana receives, actually, the number we had is about 100,000 metric tons of waste clothing coming into Ghana every single year. It's ridiculously large. 30–40% of that is end of life. It cannot just be used anymore, you know? And the legislation in the EU, in North America, is tightening around this stuff. But if you think about it, it's not just a waste anymore. It's a raw material now. If you really have a mindset now on recycling, on mechanical recycling, on circularity. And it's precisely what we want to do now. So in our new park, what we are going to do is that we are going to have a sorting center. So we have space in Akosombo now that we are going to use for sorting. So you can sort out the clothes, and then you do recycling in one of two forms. There's mechanical recycling, there's chemical recycling. There was a large conference in Milano, ITMA conference, where we went on machinery sourcing. And the machinery now has improved significantly, that you basically can take a t-shirt and you can shred it. And once you shred it, it opens up the fibers and you get sort of the yarn out again. And you take that yarn, what we show here is that you take that yarn, so you sort out the waste clothing, you get the fibers again, and you take that recycled fibers over here, and you blend it in with virgin organic fibers again, and then you go through the entire process. So if you go into shops in the US now, you see t-shirts, just read sort of like, you know, the label at the back. It will tell you 20% recycled cotton or 10% recycled cotton or this type of stuff. This is exactly the business model they have in mind. And it's a fast-growing sector. It's a fast-growing opportunity. So for the colleagues from Ministry of Sanitation, the answer is yes, yes, and yes. I can discuss sort of the more detailed plans with you. Ourselves at Akosombo and then the colleagues at VRA, we have a very green mindset on this, that we can actually pick up the unused clothing, recycle them, sort them out, blend it with the virgin organic stuff, and then go through the process again. And by the way, all of this is jobs. It's job creation. So if you look at the way these sorting centers work, if you went out, say, to India, you can do it it's just going to even have like another 500, 1,000 people in there just doing the sorting, right? Just figuring out what is wool, what is cotton, what is polyester. There's a lot of automation along that whole value chain, and you can do something and do it very well. The reason why they are not able to do all this sorting in North America and in Europe is that at some stage in the sorting, you need to take out the trims. You need to take out the buttons, the zips, and this type of stuff. And those things are labor intensive. And Prof, they've still not been able to automate that because it just needs people to mechanically sort of take those things out. And for us, it's a big opportunity. So once I know that, okay, bingo, this stage, you really need us to help in doing that. So we see it as a big opportunity, and we have more slides and presentations that talk specifically about this circularity story. And then I think the other question about sustainability in the value chain. So the textiles and garment industry is probably the third most polluting after sort of fossil fuels and then sort of heavy industry, steel, cement, and this type of stuff. And I think that is really what has pushed a lot of like the EU legislation as well as the international brands to look for sustainability. It will never be zero, but it can really be abated to a significant extent. And the way we present the value chain, you know, if you look at the way West Africa produces this, the cotton is actually predominantly rain-fed organic cotton which is being produced. So it's very sustainably produced. The fiber, the yarn, the garment, everything is also produced with a minimal carbon footprint. So the energy consumption very low, the biomass production. So you get a very good sort of like, you know, carbon credits over there. The dyeing and finishing stage, the technology has actually moved now to using plant-based pigment dyes. And a lot of the dyeing now is waterless dyeing. You heard me right, waterless dyeing. So you're gonna get to a stage where you're using minimal water, minimal pollutants. And even the effluents that come out of it, ultimately you can do zero liquid discharge recycling of the effluents that come out. So basically, whatever is fed out then gets totally recycled, and the final sort of liquid that you get, you recycle it back into the process again. So you can use it, you know, in cleaning or in watering the gardens or something. If you go out to the Hawassa Industrial Park in southern Ethiopia, you'd see it in action. And it's precisely the same thing that we want to do. So basically, we want to make sure that it's as green, net zero, sort of like very minimal pollution. So all those questions are valid. I think you are spot on. To the extent that it is a big problem, it is a big opportunity for us. And a lot of the brands are really keeping a very keen eye on our progress because, I mean, we would deliver the jobs, we would help the environment, we would employ people, and we would also try and make money for our country at the same time.
Thank you. Thank you, Philip. So, Prof, can you comment on Alex's question?
Yes, I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to be very brief. But you know, what Philip said is exactly the equation. So when you have a difficulty and you have this pressure from the consumption markets, it's an opportunity. And you know, latecomers can leapfrog and go into technological solutions that are available, that are low carbon, and that still have, and this is the critical element, still have a labor component that is quite important. Because in a lot of the industries, you have high degrees of robotization and automation. So Africa should not select those as a priority. Shouldn't be completely out of it. But these are much more difficult in terms of entering into a market that has a high degree of global input and technological intensity that will not be able to dominate unless we sort of graduate in the way we deal with industrial policy. So you have to start somewhere. And you start normally where there is a labor intensity that is higher. And in this case, when you can actually take advantage of some opportunities that are related to what the consumer market is asking. In this case, they are asking for low carbon. They want certifications that are going to be very difficult for those who have already established capacity to migrate towards. If you are a latecomer, you kind of jump. You jump the queue, and you can take advantage of it. That's what Philip was explaining. And I think it's very important for us to bear in mind that we are in various cycles of delocalization of industrial production. So we had, from the time that the Industrial Revolution started, we have been delocalizing the center of gravity of industrial production from one geographical region to another, to another. And Africa now has the opportunity of being the next turn because of its demographics, but also because of other dimensions than demographics, namely the energy-related ones, the critical minerals-related ones. So it doesn't mean we are going to do it in all areas for all sectors, because a lot of them have a high degree of dependency on intellectual property that is very difficult for us to acquire. But for those areas where intellectual property is not the main dominant factor, but rather other dimensions, we still have a good chance. Those are the systemic changes that one needs to bear in mind on the industrial side. On the financial side, we don't have time to go through it, but it's exactly the point. The African Climate Summit is an attempt now to recenter the debate about finance to touch into the regulatory systemic issues and not just be about how much climate finance we get, how much concessional lending we get, but rather let's touch into the core that is making the system work the way it is working, which is not favorable to Africa.
Thank you. There's a question at the back. Yes, can you please come forward? I'm sorry, because of the mic, so we can't bring the mic to you, so you have to come to the mic.
Sorry. Thank you very much. My first question, you already answered it. I was wondering what you do with the dye effluents, the wastewater, and I think you answered that. But I'm much particular about, first of all, the culture of especially Ghanaians and Africans on a small scale, and you are bringing industrialization in, and we are used to manual work. So I don't know how you're going to Ghanaians are going to maximize the profit and the employment opportunities there. We don't want the case that most of the times Ghanaians get to do the manual work and the technical work that gets most of the money goes elsewhere. So what systems are in place to link Ghana's culture on small scale and sharing things and the manual work to them exploring bigger benefits and getting to the big gigs? Yes, that's my question.
Okay, we can take a couple more questions. So any more questions? Right, Philip.
Maybe I answer this while we wait. So thank you very much. The culture of industrialization. It's interesting, when we started looking at these plans again, it's interesting, but this is really the way Akosombo VRA and Akosombo Textiles had been designed, going back to Nkrumah's plans at independence. And it's interesting, but it was very far-sighted because they had it in a very green way, if you think about it. There was a dam, there were natural resources up north, there's lake transport already in Ghana, you could bring it down, you could connect to Tema and export it. So if you really ask me, it isn't sort of like, a rapid thinking. It is really literally going back to the plans from the 1960s, picking them up, dusting them up and saying, hey, look, we've run out of time, we need to hurry up and run with this. So that really gives me a lot of encouragement. I mean, we present these things in nice presentations, but the ideas, if you really ask me, is what we should have been doing from the 1960s. And we just went to sleep for 50 years. We've woken up to it. The world now needs the stuff in a green and sustainable way, and I am very confident we'll be able to deliver on that. The second one is the culture and sort of industrial sort of development and production. So there already are factories in Tema, in Ghana now, that are actually employing 4,000 or 5,000 people in the garment industry, working with the World Bank, working with IFC. They are exporting into the US market under AGOA. And they are just Ghanaians living around Ashaiman, living around Tema, who wake up, go there, they work, and they do it very well. Another personal favorite of mine is Blue Skies Juice. Again, stop in Dobro, in Sawam, you'd see them. Ghanaians on the assembly line working, total net sort of top line revenues, $150, $200 million. The margins they are making must be $20 million a year. And they are exporting to Tesco's and Sainsbury's. It's fresh juice, which is going out to Europe. So the industrial culture, the way of working, we can absolutely do it. I mean, when you go to these factories in China, you know, when I got involved in Akosombo Textiles in 2018, we visited all these factories in China, in Shandong province, High Target, and a couple of these places who are actually producing the wax prints. The machinery they have is actually not Chinese. The machinery is coming from Germany and from Japan. And they just sit there and they just do it, and they do it very quickly. And they actually showed me the factories. They showed me sort of the sources where I could buy the machines and the trade fairs where we could get the machines too. So frankly, they don't have two heads. And if they can do it, then why can't we also attempt to actually do it and get onto it? So yes, the industrial culture, I think it's something we should have done 50 years ago. We have woken up to it. The world wants the resources. The world wants it done in a new way, a green way. We are late to the game, but it will be to our advantage. And inshallah, we are going to deliver on it. Thank you.
Thank you, Philip. Okay, so are there any more questions? If not, I think we have just about 5 minutes left. So are there any more questions from the floor? Okay. I don't see any hands. But what we've heard today is that Africa has always gone to COPs looking for money. You know, so we're always asking for money. But from what we've heard today, we can actually also look inwards, you know. So we've got the resources. Finance is an issue. But even for finance, we haven't exploited enough our domestic finance, private sector finance. But all that is linked to policy, as Professor Lopez said. So with the right enabling environment, we could actually increase our domestic finance revenue generation. And with the right policies and enabling environment, we could also attract external finance. So as I see it, a lot of it is in our own hands. But what is needed is really the policy to generate, to set a vision, to set the targets, the goals, and also to create the enabling environment for both domestic and external finance to thrive. So my takeaway from this is that we can do a lot to actually advance our development process. And the climate change, to me, is actually an opportunity from what we've heard today. So that's my main takeaway. So on behalf of ASSET, on behalf of the V20, I'd like to thank all of you for making time to be with us. And I hope you enjoy the rest of the sessions to come. So thank you very much. And please, some of the speakers have had to go to other speaking engagements. So they are left with, so help me in thanking the speakers.